The Rings of Power is a awful show, and at this point we all know that. I already made a video analyzing the poor character work of Sauron and Galadriel in the first season, but that criticism isn't nearly enough. Honestly, there's so much to criticize about the show that you could make college courses about it. This show is, when it comes to horrible Hollywood productions, the absolute rock bottom. The reason for that is very simple. When you compare this show to the source material, I've never seen a bigger downgrade. And in all honesty, compared to this garbage, The Acolyte seems like a true masterpiece. In this video, I'm not going to give you an in-depth analysis of everything that's wrong with it, but more of a collection of a bunch of things so you can understand how truly awful it is. And this is all thanks to J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, who are so incredibly untalented that it hurts me without even being on the same continent as the two. So the obvious thing to begin with is that the order of the creation of the rings is wrong. The order from the lore is that there were a bunch of lesser rings created and then the Rings of Power, starting with the 7 rings for the dwarves, the 9 for men, and then Celebrimbor created the 3 elven rings alone. All the rings were created with the help from Anatar, who is Sauron, except for the 3 elven rings, but those 3 still were created with knowledge obtained from him, and therefore they could also be corrupted, just not as easily as the other Rings of Power. And lastly, Sauron created the 1 ring. Well, it's hard to believe that I actually have to say that, but Sauron is actually the antagonist in The Lord of the Rings. Now, you might think that's obvious, but if you actually watch the show, you could seriously ask yourself if these dumb writing this actually know that. The reason is that the presentation of Sauron in this show is so fucking horrible. In order to understand that, we need to look at the dynamic of good versus evil, not just in The Lord of the Rings, but in storytelling in general. To oversimplify it, there are 2 types of dynamics, the good versus evil story and the story in which characters exist in a grey area. Guess which one a religious Catholic would write? A story with a character that embodies the devil and his followers being the personification of everything bad, or a story in which the orcs are just another faction with personal interests of family protection and belonging, and their leader basically trying to get elected, being in love with his enemies, emotional and seemingly misunderstood. If you guessed the first, you'd be correct, which is why it's hard for me to understand why the Rings of Power chose the second. The reality is that Tolkien was a religious Catholic, which is why his ideas of good and evil is heavily influenced by his religious beliefs. In other stories, the author will try to make you understand the antagonist, and I usually really like that. The quote-unquote bad guy can be presented as multifaceted and more difficult than just pure evil. This can be done by making him show emotions and motives that make us understand his actions. The thing is that Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is not supposed to be that. If you look at the books and the Peter Jackson trilogy, Sauron is presented as nothing more than the personification of evil. There's never an attempt to make him appear human or understandable, but in the fucking Rings of Power, rather than expanding on the works of a brilliant author, these untalented hacks think that they can change this very important part of the lore. Sauron in the Rings of Power actually never really appears that evil. Really, the only way we know that he's evil at all is because we know who Sauron is from the lore. In the show, he never really tricks or manipulates people, rather everyone around him is just particularly stupid. All his actions can only be presented as evil because you are being told so by other characters, or because we know about it from the context of The Lord of the Rings as a whole. The failure to present Sauron in the way that he should be also extends to the orcs, who in The Lord of the Rings are presented as animalistic. They are pure evil, and one of the great things about them is that they are presented in a way that makes it practically impossible for someone to like or identify with them. They are ruthless, easily fall into blood frenzy, are stupid, and very interestingly so, they are also very cowardly. They represent literally the worst type of life form imaginable. They are supposed to be an inversion of the elves. That's quite literally true, especially when you look at how they were created. Tolkien wrote them in a way that there's no chance for anyone with proper morals to ever root for them. But in the Rings of Power, they are presented like they're just another faction in the war. They are a faction with understandable, almost human-like interests. Those, of course, are peace, home, family, freedom, and self-governance. The professor's spinning in his grave right now. While watching, all you could ask yourself is, why the fuck are the writers trying to make me like them? I'll leave the answer to that question up to you. For some fucking reason, the Balrog of Khazad Dûm appears. The reason, of course, is that modern Hollywood writers could never write a story that could stand on its own, which is why they have to feed us member berries. Look, something is happening on the screen that I've seen before. I like this now, even though it has no benefit to the story, is what a low IQ person would think. The Balrog, of course, is not supposed to be there for the next 2000 years. Not only that, but Balrogs in general are never mentioned to be part of the story during that time anywhere. That being said, even though in the lore Balrogs don't appear during that time, doesn't mean that they didn't do anything in Middle-earth at all. The problem here is not necessarily that they put the Balrog in, but that they do it in a useless fucking way. The Balrog wakes up and kills King Durin and then just drops into the mountain and I guess goes back to sleep. Why put him in then? It was a stupid addition that did nothing of note for the story. Another character that was absolutely butchered by the show is Galadriel. When it comes to the lore, she's cool and powerful, but they completely changed her. In the lore, she's a tall and wise elf that has been part of the story of Valinor and Middle-earth for a long time. But she was never a warrior like she is in the Rings of Power. She's not supposed to be this tiny lady running around armor, climbing mountains and hunting orcs to fulfill a personal vendetta. Her strengths are supposed to be leadership and wisdom rather than direct fighting. She's wise, and it's crazy to me that they made her the one that gets tricked by Sauron. She behaves arrogant and mistreats her subordinates. None of that is consistent with the lore. In the First Age, she simply does not play a big role in fighting Morgoth, especially not on the battlefield. So where the fuck do the producers of the show get the idea that Tolkien intended her to be this female warrior who runs around Middle-earth killing orcs and trolls, gets involved with battles and so on? Also, Galadriel at that time is supposed to have a family. Guess that doesn't work when you try to present her as an independent badass warrior woman. Wouldn't want her to be tied down by a loving husband and kids, that'd be awful. In the lore, she's married to Celeborn and has a daughter. Celebrian used to travel with her, especially during that time. Celeborn has been an important character who has been present in Eregion, so I don't see a reason as to why he's not present in the show. The only explanation that comes to my mind, besides the producer's attempt to present Galadriel in a certain way, is that they don't want her to be married so that they can ship her with other characters. And they do that. They kinda imply romantic tension between her and Sauron, as well as her and Elrond. Given that Elrond will end up marrying Celebrian, Galadriel's daughter, that's kinda disgusting. But, I mean, sexual degeneracy isn't really new for Hollywood. The fall of Eregion, of course, is also not according to lore. Besides that, the story about how it gets attacked is stupid as fuck. But first things first. Celebrimbor, before he dies, gets tortured by Sauron. He does that in order to find out where the rings are. After that, the body of Celebrimbor gets paraded around by Sauron's army. That story wouldn't fit in the show though, because they want to present Sauron in a more human way, where it would be able for the audience to feel with him. Killing Celebrimbor in such a horrible way would not be beneficial to their presentation of Sauron. The Fall of Eregion in the show has a terrible storyline, because it's from all points of view very illogical. The orcs got rid of Sauron and know that he wanted them to attack Eregion, so they do, even though they see him as their enemy. That makes sense, right? They think that Sauron will be stuck in the city where they can kill him. But if you know that attacking Eregion is part of his plan, why would you take the risk of attempting to subvert his own plan? Knowing his plan and his abilities to trick them, it would seem obvious that just doing as he planned and backstabbing him is not as easy as you'd think. In the show, Sauron is also not established as the Dark Lord, and his powers are threatened by Adar. This is definitely not how Tolkien would have written the story. The Dark Lords Morgoth and later Sauron were quasi-angelic beings before they turned evil. Their power should be so great that they should be the undisputed lords of evil forces in Middle-earth. It is absolutely insane to believe that some orc would be the one trying to take his place. That plot took so much away from the perceived power of Sauron. It made him look weak. Actually, making powerful characters seem weak and evil characters seem less evil is a reoccurring theme in this show. Elrond is a twink, Sauron cries, Celebrimbor is a fucking retard, Isildur is a useless sack of shit, his father sims for the queen, and Durin behaves like a man-child. Speaking of storylines that Tolkien would have never written that way, the King of Numenor in this show is decided by an eagle. Now, obviously the professor is dead and we can't ask him how he would have written this story, but based on what he has written, I think we can easily make an educated guess about what he most definitely would not have written. In this show, the Queen Regent is supposed to become the Queen of Numenor. During her crowning, The eagle randomly appears and lands next to this guy who is then decided to become the king. That's crazy because the appearance of the eagle is totally random. He has not been involved with the story at any point. They only put the eagle in the show for the same reason they put in the Balrog. We have seen it before. It's something cool from the original movies, member berries. Besides that, the eagles are supposed to be highly intelligent and can communicate. Whether that's by speaking directly or not is not clear, but the idea that they would just land and then do nothing is ridiculous. So even though we don't have Tolkien's perspective on that, I think it's pretty easy to say that this is not how he would have written it. What's even funnier is that this situation is resolved when the queen gets swallowed by a sea monster and then spit out again, thereby making her the queen. Isn't that crazy? The entire story of who gets to become the king is an eagle randomly appears, so the one guy gets to be king, and then a sea monster swallows and spits someone else out, so they become king. What the actual was that supposed to be? The battle in the second season was made to be a big deal by the marketing department. Oh, we're going to have a battle over 2 episodes. The problem is that the entire story surrounding the battle and the battle itself sucks. The entire army moves around the country without getting noticed by anyone that then informs Eregion. This is so insane when you think about it. It means that either the entire land between Mordor and Eregion is so uninhabited that no one sees the army walking towards the city, or that no one thinks about informing the city. This army is so obvious that they look like a burning train slowly crawling through the land, leaving a trail of destruction. Seems to me like there should be scouts informing one of the most important cities of the entire Elven realm. In the 2 towers, the surprise attack makes sense because the people were on the move and their enemies were moving fast. This logic doesn't really work with a slow-moving army. Couple of smaller things, the catapults across the river are not getting attacked. Crazy to think that the city has walls, so they are clearly prepared for attacks. So why are there no catapults or ballistics on the side of the city? Also, Celebrimbor, who's the lord of the city, is not getting consulted during the attack. That's because Sauron, disguised as Anatar, leads the city instead of Celebrimbor, who is a captive in his illusion spell. The fact that no one defending the city finds it weird that the lord of the city is not consulted and gets sent away when going to the wall. The soldiers even listen to Anatar instead of Celebrimbor. Mind you, Anatar has done nothing to trick these people. He spends all his time in Eregion with Celebrimbor. That explains why Celebrimbor trusts him. But why would high-ranking officers do so, once Celebrimbor and Anatar's views are opposed? Well, I guess the writers are just morons, and what even are motivations? Also, these are just side characters, so clearly the writers think that you can just make them do whatever the story needs. Also, there's one of the most insane storylines connected to the battle that I've ever seen. The army that is supposed to aid Eregion arrives, and when they are about to attack, the orcs show them that they have Galadriel captive. That causes the entire army to call off their attack. None of that makes any sense. The horses simply cannot stop in their tracks like that. The entire army is moving at once. All of the people in the back have no clue what the is going on, and the command to stop the army would have to take so long that the backside of the army would just run into the front. I guess that doesn't matter though. But then when the army stops, the elves decide to have a little parley with the orcs. Totally something they would do. Mind you, while they are having their nice little chat, the army of the orcs is still in the process to sack the city. Just some nice little destruction, murder and pillaging in the back while the elves are consulting with their enemy. All that because they have Galadriel, our brave hero who wanted to work together with the orcs. Totally not treason, by the way. And while we are here, Elrond kisses Galadriel. That of course only happens because he wants to give her the tool to free herself. It has nothing to do with the writers putting in a little something called shipping. Isn't that great? Shipping Galadriel, a married woman with children, and Elrond? The show in general presents him like a twin for whatever reason. Isn't he supposed to be a badass? A man fighting wars for literally thousands of years? He could have needed a different actor. That's just me though. Maybe the mythical modern audience enjoys frail-looking leaders. Also in the very beginning of the show, he tries to deny the elves from having the rings by jumping off a waterfall. Shortly thereafter, they get the rings anyways, and besides looks of disapproval, Elrond never tries to deny the rings ever again. Great stuff. Speaking of great stuff, that reminds me of the Hobbits. Hobbits are part of the story of the Second Age, you ask? Oh, you stupid viewer, you are thinking of the Lord of the Rings, but this is the Rings of Power and therefore has nothing to do with that. Writers with 5 writing credits to their name know way better than that old straight white male professor. To get around this annoying creativity destroying thing called lore, these creatures aren't actually hobbits. They are Harfoots, you see. Totally has nothing to do with hobbits. One thing that's great about them is that their storyline is actually as meaningless as the writer's existence. They accomplish absolutely nothing. Here's the story. A diverse group of morons runs around Middle-earth until one day a comet falls from the sky. Actually, they find out it isn't even a comet, but Gandalf, a random guy who totally isn't Gandalf. With totally not Gandalf, they go to Ruin. There Gandalf meets Tom Bombadil, just why did you have to bring him into this? And learns about his powers. And that's essentially it. One thing that really pissed me off about these hobbits is that for some reason they are portrayed like they are mentally handicapped. They talk and walk like they are slow or something. Just why? You realize that hobbits are just short, right? They are not The hobbits, of course, should not be a part of the story. It's just member berries that are supposed to be there for the built-in audience. The same audience who sadly cares about lore accuracy, so by having them in, you shoot yourself in the foot. Also, if you want to make them more appealing to the built-in audience, don't rip off Frodo and Sam and turn them female. Don't make them appear handicapped and make them immersive by not having them be a group of diverse LA homeless crackheads. It's medieval age and they're a small group for God's sakes. They need to be ethnically homogeneous. And don't have the black guy with the Irish accent. It's actually insulting how cringe that was. The stranger, that we all knew to be Gandalf from the very beginning, is just another crime against Tolkien's legacy. He does nothing other than traveling to Rune and defending himself against people trying to attack him or the hobbits. It's actually crazy how he and the hobbits have a storyline that achieves nothing just for the sake of showing you what you already know. Gandalf obviously shouldn't be there as well. In the lore he only appears like 1000 years into the Third Age, nowhere close to the time this takes place. Oh, and by the way, if the Dark Wizard turns out to be Saruman, I will. Now, lastly, we can't not talk about the obvious. We all notice that the elves are ethnically diverse and that's retarded. That's obvious. The problem with that criticism is that the distractors, that being the people who defend the show, use that criticism to discredit the ones who see the show for what it is. Garbage. The distractors point to that criticism and say that everyone who criticizes the show for that reason is racist. Thereby they find a way to point to the dislike of the show and claim that the reason for the dislike is that the fandom is simply toxic and racist. The problem with that is that the narrative simply no longer works the way it did in the past. You can no longer point the finger at critics and discredit people like that. People see through that tactic now more than ever. The thing is that Tolkien himself already thought about the ethnicities of Middle-earth. And because Tolkien wrote the story envisioning a mythology for Great Britain, he didn't imagine the figures to be diverse, simply because of the makeup of that country. At no point did Tolkien imagine the elves to be black or Chinese. They are supposed to be a singular race, with minor differences between the different elven groups. They at one point woke up as a group together created by Iluvatar. The reason for that criticism of the show is not based in racism, but in storytelling and lore accuracy. There are those who simply don't want the lore to be changed, and that's understandable and should be enough. But if you think that's a minor detail that can be changed, that's fine, you can have your opinions, but here's why I would disagree. World building is an important aspect of storytelling, and when you read great authors, you can notice that. Tolkien himself wrote an immensely immersive world. Brandon Sanderson does so too. He as well accounts for ethnicities in his stories. The reason is that they are an aspect of nature, and the closer a story is to the familiar, even in fantasy, the more immersive it is. And remember, even in fantasy, we want stories to at least feel like they could be believable, which is why authors spend so much time explaining the world their story takes place in. The problem with all of this is not just the fact that the show isn't lore accurate. If they would have changed the lore and it magically would have been better, that would be somewhat okay and acceptable. The thing is that they aren't half the writers that Tolkien was. Therefore, you could only make it worse, and that's exactly what happened. You could have just adapted this great story, but instead you replaced the lore with your own trash. Well done. This show is not made for fans of the franchise or new fans. Why? Because the new fans will not get the member berries because they simply don't know about the lore. Bombadil, for example. New viewers know nothing about the guy and just see this useless guy for some fucking reason in some fucking mud hut. And fans of the franchise will also not enjoy the story because it bothers them that Gandalf is there even though he's not supposed to be. Old fans get pissed off because the show is unfaithful, and new fans simply get a show with bad storytelling, logical inconsistencies, and badly written characters as well as bad world building. Anyways, that's it guys. I know the video is called Everything Wrong with the Rings of Power, but I probably haven't even scratched the surface. If you think I've missed something, let me know in the comments. In the future I will most certainly come back to this show, especially if they produce a third or fourth season.